Islander peoples of this nation. We acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation as traditional custodians of the land on which Maribyrnong City Council is located and where we conduct our business. We also acknowledge the custodians of the lands of all our participants this evening. We pay our respects to ancestors and elders past and present. We are committed to honouring Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, waters and seas and their rich contribution to society. Good evening everyone and welcome to our very first online writers workshop. It is wonderful to see you all. My name is Lyndall. I'm the team leader of the Yarraville Library and I'll be your host this evening. Let's get on with the evening. An evening of insights, tips and inspiration. Joining us tonight is Karina Kilmore. She has over 30 years experience as a writer and as a newspaper journalist. She's written for magazines, for papers, news websites, and altogether her published work would be the equivalent of over 30 novels. In 2017, she was shortlisted for the prestigious Unpublished Manuscripts Award at the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards for her novel, Where the Truth Lies. And in March this year, right before lockdown, this book was published by Simon and Schuster. I'd like to welcome our very special guest, Karina Kilmore. Welcome, Karina. It's wonderful to have you
much. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm a little bit nervous, everybody, so treat me kindly, please. This is the first Zoom workshop I've done, and I've been really looking forward to doing it. So a little bit about me. I was brought up by my grandmother in a very large political family in New Zealand. We had a strange sort of dysfunctional tradition where my mother was brought up by her grandmother and she lived in a big old timber house with her father and a whole bunch of bachelor uncles. They were all ruled over by the matriarch, my great-grandmother, Nana Douglas. These men, my grandfather and great-uncles, were labourers and wharfies and truck drivers, and they were all very staunch unionists. So with a background like that, what do I go and do? I enter the corporate world, but not before I dropped out of school, high school at age 14. And I got myself a job. Luckily, I was taken under the wing of some very good people, some very good bosses. And when I was old enough, I was encouraged to go to uni. So as an adult student, I went back to uni. But that was not before I worked in a factory screwing on bottle tops as they sped past on a conveyor belt. I worked in a call centre selling ads and then as a typesetter for a newspaper. So as soon as I was old enough to qualify as an adult student, I started my education again, studying part-time for a business degree. And that's where I learned more about the economy and capitalism and the other side of that big tribal union divide, which I'd grown up in. But office work wasn't where my heart lay. And while I was still working as a typesetter for my local newspaper, my boss encouraged me to switch to journalism. And that's where I've been ever since, specialising in finance and business reporting. So you could say multiple crime stories. During that time, I've written about, as Lyndall said, 3 million words for newspapers and publications, which is the equivalent of about 30 novels. Added to that, I've also written 3 non-fiction investment and finance books. I've also been a books editor and I'm still a regular published book reviewer. But my first novel, my first fiction work, is a new benchmark for me. The title is Where the Truth Lies, and here's one I produced earlier. It was published in March, just in time for the lockdown, sadly, and cancellation of my book tour and all the book events. but I'll give you the elevator pitch because I practiced it at the time, even though I never got to say it. So the elevator pitch was, it's about a Melbourne journalist who investigates a death at the wharf, and she's caught between the worlds of blue-collar and white-collar crime. And underlying the story is a lot of real-life newsroom activity, the changing media, and a few secrets and hidden pasts. And it's all set around gorgeous Melbourne. But of course, that's all wrapped up in a gritty urban crime story, and it's told through the eyes of my damaged but feisty main character, Chrissy O'Brien. So that's me, and that's my book. And so let's get on to the topics now that I'd like to discuss with you all tonight. It's aimed at helping you to start writing your novel, your first novel. I did it, so I think you can do it too. And I hope that anything I've got tonight to say will help you along the way. So the first three things I wanted to talk about was establishing a writing routine, how to narrow down your story ideas, and choosing the best starting point. And if you're wondering, I've got these dot points on my screen, so I might look a bit shifty, but I'm just sort of trying to catch up on to make sure that I've got all my dot points covered. So establishing a writing routine, find a day or time or a combination of days where you can set aside a writing time. This could be a daily writing hour, or twice a week, or even once a week. You also need to decide on a space where you can spend this time, and try out the space or try out a couple of spaces. Listen for noises and vision and the comfort of the space. It also may not be in your home. It may be at a library or a community centre, which, by the way, are great places for observing characters. It could be a cafe or a friend's house. You could buddy up with someone to keep each other accountable. Just don't talk too much or drink too much. But think about where you need, what you need in your space and what time you'll be able to devote to it. Of course, COVID is a barrier to some of these locations at the moment, but think outside the square. It doesn't have to be a desk at home. I suggested to a friend recently that she writes in her car. It was the only place she could get away from her crowded house, and it's working. She takes a coffee and a snack, a laptop or a notepad, her latest book or research, and she sits in the passenger seat of the car in the street outside her house. She's still close enough to connect to her Wi-Fi, so she uses her car for her writing time. Even if you don't actually do much writing during this time, still make yourself go and sit in your writing spot for the whole time regardless. If you're not writing or you're having doubts about how to keep going, use this writing time for thinking instead, which, when you think about it, is a real luxury these days. I mean, how often do we ever get time just to sit and think? So think about your books that you like or stories you'd like to write in the future. Think about what you've written so far. If you're starting a new project, write an outline or a rough plot line, or describe your main character. Maybe you're a visual person, sketch a location or draw one of your characters, or just note down potential story ideas or new angles for an existing novel, new themes, just anything really. Ideally, this regular time should be at least an hour, but preferably 2 or more hours in each block, because by the time you get into your headspace, you can often already have used up quite a bit of your writing time. So to recap on routine, find your time and your days, and whether you're writing or not, still go to your writing spot and use that time for thinking or reading or planning. And of course, when you are in the swing of it all, you'll already have this routine established and it'll feel more comfortable and easy to actually do the writing. Now, this is also a bit of a tricky point, but just a note on family and friends. Some people will find that their partners or kids aren't as supportive as they hope. It usually starts out okay, but then precious writing time or your preoccupation with your writing can sometimes cause resentment. Hopefully this is not your experience, but sometimes family or friends can question your writing aspirations or minimise your efforts, or just make you doubt yourself. Even if you know these comments come from selfishness or the person's different priorities, they can still hurt and they can make it hard to talk about your writing with them. And it can make you feel guilty about taking time or just make you doubt yourself. So on the surface, some of these comments and reactions can seem as if they're sensible or logical, but underneath there can also be some sabotage going on. So don't think you're alone if you start to feel pressure like this. It's known, it's common, and it's like everything else to do with writing, it's hard and you just have to stick to your guns. Okay, let's go on to the next topic, which is how to narrow down your story ideas. Most writers seem to have lots of story ideas, but the ideas seem to fall into two camps. One camp is the big picture. They have a rough idea of the arc of the story, what its main theme or plot is going to be about, but not too much detail about the beginning or the characters or how to get to the middle or to the end. So that's a big picture idea. The other type of ideas person seems to be very focused. The idea is often just about one small event or one character, but again, with not much detail about everything else around that event or how to showcase that character in a long piece of work. Your writing routine is the perfect space and time to think about how to flesh out more details. For the big picture ideas, start thinking about who's going to carry that idea. Is it going to be a main character or three characters, or perhaps it's going to be a location? And just a word about location. Ideally, you always need to have been to the location you're writing about. But now with Google Earth or Street View, it opens up other options. So it's actually quite a good way to travel from your Zoom lounge. For writers with a very specific or narrow focused idea, start thinking about other characters or side issues which could be used to lead into the main event. In both cases, if you're a big ideas or a focused ideas person, start thinking about building a support or framework around your character, ideally or around your big event. Ideally, as a reader, we want to know how someone has changed or something changes someone. But no one can tell you where your story has to go or how many subplots or themes or characters. It's totally in your hands. But one of the biggest hurdles for many writers, even really experienced writers, is they get lost or stuck at about 20,000 words. They've been so excited about their big picture or their detailed character that they don't have enough world building around them to keep going. This also usually means many writers fall into one or two other groups known as pantsers and plotters. A pantser, that's me. I fly by the seat of my pants. I have a rough idea of my story and just get stuck in and write, often letting the story take me where it wants to go. A plotter, which is what I suggest everyone else should be, plans out their story and characters, their timelines and their themes in advance. But I think in a real world, a mixture of both is probably going to suit most writers. That could be something like not plotting a whole novel, but setting out a chapter list of what you want to happen. You don't have to stick to the list, but at least it's a little roadmap during those times when you realise you're not sure what to write next. For new and emerging writers, until you get into your own swing of things, I think a rough outline or chapter list can really save you a lot of frustration. So just a final few words on how to narrow down your story idea. If you take up some of the plotter habits, even just attempt a rough chapter list, regardless if you're a big picture ideas person or a small focused ideas person, I think you'll almost automatically see where you need to bring in new characters or expand on the main trigger event or add some themes so that you can broaden your story, because your chapter list is going to look very thin and small. So that's sort of like an automatic signal that you need to think a bit broader than your original idea, or to narrow down your original idea and focus in on some of the smaller details. So our third topic for this part is choosing the starting point of your story. And I'm going to use the word story more for this point because it applies equally to a work of fiction or non-fiction, and probably to other writing forms too, such as poems and songs. But choosing where to start your story, either for a novel or a short story or a non-fiction book, is really important. The start of your writing has to grab the reader's attention. It's a lot like journalism. The most exciting, emotional, shocking thing should come first. If the opening pages or chapter don't grab the reader, then the reader won't ever get to see that you saved up the best bits for later. But by this, I don't mean you have to tell everything or spoil the plot in the first few pages. I mean that you need to make people care as soon as possible. Make them care about finding the answer if you pose a question. Make them care about the main character if you start with a person. Make them care about the repercussions of an event if you start with a restaurant scene or an explosion or a car crash, a boxing match, a divorce, or someone saying goodbye to their pet dog. The reader has to care about what comes next. And this applies pretty much always. Even if you're writing a memoir or a family saga, start off with a hint of the most fascinating or devastating or exhilarating event in that story. And once you have your reader caring, you can go back and begin to trickle out the full details of the story. So to recap where to start your story, start at the point where you'll make the reader care. Okay, so let's get to some questions about those 3 points. So the 3 points that we discussed were setting a routine, expanding on your story idea, and where to start your story.
Okay, Karina, we have a question.
Great.
It has to deal with how you deal with frustration. Any tips on what to do when you're feeling frustrated in your writing?
I haven't got a solution to that because I get frustrated and I usually stay frustrated. But I know 2 authors who stop writing and they go for a run. Physical exercise seems to be like a good way to clear the mind if you're stuck on a story point. The most I can manage is sort of like a half trot, but it's a really hard one. Frustration it can be quite devastating. It can throw you off your story. It can throw you off your confidence, and it can really make you start wondering if you should be doing this at all. So I think you just have to work through it. You just have to push through it.
And there's another question. You made the point that to start with the most exhilarating point of the story to get people in. Can a powerful writing style overcome the need to start with the most exhilarating point of the story?
Yes, I think it can. I just read, I've just been doing some judging. I've just read a book where it started in a very unconventional way, and it was a very lyrical, sort of long-winded introduction, but it still gripped my attention. And that sort of writing is really hard to do. I think it was a very experienced author, they're sort of into their 20-something book. So it's a very hard thing to do, to attract someone's attention without it being exciting or something to make you care about at the start. So I wouldn't recommend it for new or emerging writers, but there are lots of examples of that type of writing where you lull someone almost into a false sense of security, or you just sort of let them softly come into your story life. And it's lovely writing, but it's really hard to do.
How do you deal with self-criticism?
Oh, this is really hard. I've got a few points about that coming up in something I'm going to talk about later. I'm my biggest critic, so that's and I've worked in newspapers all my life, and you can't have a thin skin in newspapers. You're shouted at. You're told you're useless. It's a really tough environment to work. So you develop a very thick skin. And when I read the first review of my novel, I was just devastated by it. It was by someone who wanted to make a name for themselves as to get the first copy of my book and to write a eye-catching review about it. And as a reviewer myself, I would never write a review like this person wrote about my book. I would always be, you judge a book by its type, not about, it shouldn't really be about your personal opinion. So I'll talk about having a thick skin later on, but it's really hard. Now that I'm a published author, it's really hard. As a journalist, I was used to the trolling, used to the abuse, which is a daily thing as a journalist. But as an author, where it's like a personal piece of writing, I wasn't prepared for how difficult I would find it.
We have a message here saying, "Hi, Karina, thank you for your insight. What is your advice when dealing with writer's block in the area of non-fiction, where you are unable to create characters, ideas to propel your writing forward?"
Yeah. So I've written non-fiction all my life. As a journalist, you are a non-fiction writer. As a magazine writer, you're usually reporting on things or reporting on non-fiction. And I don't believe in writer's block. I don't think that you can have writer's block. Why would writers, a bus driver can't have a bus driver's block, or a chef can't have a chef block? I think you've got to get that idea out of your mind. There's no such thing as writer's block. If you need to take a break, take a break. If you're lacking ideas, then do some more research. But I've banned writer's block. It no longer exists.
That's very good. That's very, very good. Now, do you write with a particular audience in mind when you set out? Did you have an audience in mind before you started writing Where the Truth Lies?
I didn't have an audience in mind, but I like crime fiction, and so I was always leaning towards a crime fiction piece of work. And most readers are women, and most book buyers are women. I think about 80% or 80-something% of books are purchased by women. They often purchase them for their males, the males in their household. So apart from that sort of big picture world of, women were the main audience for all books, I didn't have an audience in mind. But I did have, as a woman, I wanted to write about a woman character. And I think that's really important. There's lots of women who write about male characters, especially in the crime genre. And I wanted to be a woman who wrote a female character. So that was my sort of only guiding light, really. And I'm a big fan of, or have been a big fan for many years of Sarah Paretsky, and she wrote a series of books with a really feisty, feminist character. The first one came out in the 1980s, and she was a really big inspiration for me. So I wanted a strong female character. And I wanted to write it from a woman writing from a woman's point of view as well.
How do you let go of stuff that you've written that you think is really great, but it just doesn't fit into the story?
I cut and paste it into a spare document, and I tell myself I'm not deleting it, I'm just putting it aside. And chances are I never read it again. But to actually delete it, I just can't do that straight off. I have to sort of con myself that I'm going to, I'm just taking it out for now. I'm just putting it aside, and I'll find a spot for it sometime in the future.
That's great. Thank you, Karina, for that insight. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Shall we go on to the next little bit?
I think so, yes.
Great. Okay, so the next couple of topics I'd love to discuss with you is about how to present your manuscript, self-editing, paying for an assessment or an editor, and then some quick comments about competitions. So manuscripts. I don't think anyone needs expensive or fancy software. I know lots of authors who simply use old word processing programs. Some write the whole book in one document. Another author I know opens a new document for each chapter. So he has about 30 or 40 documents, each with a chapter in it. And he likes it this way because sometimes he'll shuffle the sequence around or add or delete a whole chapter, so he finds that really easy to do. I use a program called Write It Now, and it's a cross between a normal old Word program and the more fancy, complicated programs like Scrivener. I did look at Scrivener when I first decided to write a novel, but I found it so complicated that I couldn't take the risk. I wanted to concentrate on the writing and not have to wade through a massive instruction manual each day. I also found that my writing style, which is pretty much start at the beginning and write in a logical, chronological way to the end, I found that my writing style didn't really need much of the extra fancy functions of something like Scrivener. And so I went for Write It Now. And shallow person that I am, I also like the practical name of the software. It's called Write It Now, and I just thought, oh yes, that's me. I want to write it now. But of course, I've had a couple of problems with it, and the designer is based in the UK. But every time I've emailed a query, I've received a detailed answer and not a generic reply or a bunch of self-help suggestions, but an actual email from the designer with specific solutions. So I've been really pleased with that. I found it really great. But okay, so the standard format for most manuscripts is 12-point type, a simple typeface. Some publishers will tell you their preferred typeface, and some agents too. They'll often have favourites, but generally I'd use something like a New Times Roman or something in that family. Line spacing is either 1.5 or double spacing. I strongly suggest you get used to writing this way from the start. It will go a long way to getting you in the groove of knowing how many words and pages make up your chapters and ultimately how many pages your finished book will be. That's because these settings roughly translate to a printed book page. It's also the format that assessors, editors, publishers, and competitions also want to receive their manuscripts. So it's just good housekeeping to start out this way from the very beginning. The only time I'd suggest doing another format is when you print out your novel to read on paper, and I recommend that you do this as a final step. As a writer, reading on paper is a very different experience to reading on a screen because you're less tempted to edit and change things as you read, but still keep a pen in hand to make notes. But it means you can't rewrite a whole passage, which I often do. Then when you go back and you reread the pen notes and the margins, there's another opportunity to just sit in that moment and think if it's really necessary to make that change, or think how you change the words now that you've just finished rereading the whole novel in printed form. So before printing it off, I'd shuffle the line space down to single spacing and possibly reduce the text size just to reduce the cost of printing and the weight of having to carry it around. And I think most newspapers and magazines use about an 8 or a 9 point type size. So it's not that small if you're used to reading magazines and things. But my one big tip for your manuscript is to email it to yourself every day or after every change. I'm a belt and braces and buttons and safety pins type of person. I don't trust technology, so I would never, only ever have one copy of my manuscript on a hard drive or even just one in the cloud. Each day or each time I do a chunk of writing, I email the document to 2 email addresses. One's a Gmail and the other's an iCloud. That's how cautious I am, as well as a backup in the cloud. And then sometimes when I shut down for the day, I also back up on my laptop to an external drive. Okay, so let's go on to self-editing. I seem to have 2 types of writing days. One day I'll go in with no idea what I'm going to write and just sit down and write scrappy, disjointed stuff until I hit my word target. And actually I'll just backtrack a bit there. I have a word target as my writing time motivation. I don't do 2 hours or 4 hours or of writing. I do what I call a word o'clock. So when I hit my word o'clock, that's when I stop. So on one of my scrappy writing days, I know I'm going to need to self-edit a lot the next time I read that section, but I still just keep going to get my word count, and I'll worry about fixing the scrappy writing another time. The other type of writing day I have is when I have a specific scene to write or a specific set of events to describe. On those days, I'm more focused on writing that part of the story, and I have a clearer idea of what's happening. So I find my writing quality is better if that it needs less editing the next time I read it. And by better, I mean it flows more easily from one paragraph to the next. But on those days, there's also a trade-off. I found that technically the writing might have a better flow, but I've also found that sometimes the story is not emotional enough. It provides the functional aspects of the scene and everything I need it to do, but then during self-editing or rereading, I have to inject a bit more emotion into it. So that's sort of like a bit of a trade-off. But generally, most writers seem to be one or the other of these two types. There's a lot of two types going on in this conversation, but in reality, there's sort of lots of degrees or combinations of these types. But generally, writers seem to either like to just get it on the page as quickly as possible, and worry about the exact words and storyline the next time they read it, or they are very deliberate about each sentence and each scene, and therefore they write more carefully the first time round. I think either way, you will always still need to self-edit, and by this I don't mean anything big or structural at this stage. I just mean self-editing the words that you've written. The first and only job of a self-editor is to make sure a reader will understand what you're trying to say or trying to show them. Using jargon or complicated or fancy words will usually reduce your audience and reduce your readership. I'm not a creative writing graduate or a writing academic, as most authors seem to be these days. I'm a very practical writer from a working writing background, a daily writing background, and I know almost instantly when I read a novel if someone has been overtaken by their creative writing course. In my opinion, overly descriptive writing is a big turn-off, and it distracts from the story and the characters. The same goes for an author who is box ticking to include certain plot points or story arcs because that's what a teacher's told them to do. So my best self-editing tip is to use simple and less words. See if you can rewrite your page or chapter without any adjectives. Then go back and reward yourself with 3 or 4 important descriptions. I've also included a list of my favourite editing and self-editing and writing books in a reference sheet which you can download after tonight. Okay, so on to paying for an assessment or an editor. Because I'd never written a novel before, I didn't really know what I was doing. So after my second draft, I paid for a manuscript assessment. This really opened my eyes. I was really pleased with the feedback, and it helped me polish my manuscript into the final version, which I then entered into a competition. The assessment was through a writing organisation, and I think it cost about $700. It was a reasonable amount of money, but because I was working and I had a regular income at that time, I felt the cost was worthwhile. And after getting the report back, I was really pleased with spending the money. I thought it was good value. The report was about 5 pages, and it highlighted the good bits and the bad. And it was the best feedback I've ever had. And as a beginner, it really set me on the right track. Most of the comments were general, nothing too specific about how to write or how to tell a story. But it pointed out some really interesting things, and I've made a couple of dot points about the things that were showing up. I'd left the main story for too long. Well, I took the reader to a subplot, was one of the really important points. The assessor thought that 2 of my characters were too similar to each other. The novel fell a bit flat in the middle, which is very common and known as the middle muddle. There was also too much swearing. My story included wharfies and truckies and journos, but sometimes realistic dialogue can be too real, she said. The most value I got from the assessment was the criticism. It's very rare and difficult to find honest opinions when it comes to writing, because most people don't want to offend you. If you show it to a friend, they'll love it no matter what. Even within writing groups, people are often reluctant to point out the bits that they're not keen about. And believe me, there are always those bits. But for me, all I ever wanted to know from an editor or assessor is where it's going wrong. And I have to say, however, talking about the earlier question, my attitude has changed about that now. Now that my book is published, once you're published, there's a whole world of nasty comments and trolls full of unhelpful criticism. But you just have to brace yourself with the knowledge that an agent, a publisher, an acquisitions team, an editing team, and all the bookstore owners who stocked your book have already judged your novel to be good enough. But you still need a really thick skin. Compared with an assessor, an editor does a more detailed job. An editor will actually go in and talk about the structure of the story, the timeline of including or removing information, the potential development of a character or subplot, or even suggest a whole new theme as an extra element to the novel. An editor will also comment on the emotional aspects of your story, the growth of a character, and the way information is revealed. And they'll also usually make notes and markups on the manuscript about potential solutions. And an editor will also take a big picture view of the novel and how it's likely to be received and positioned in the marketplace. Some editors will also act like semi-agents, and they have connections with publishing houses or even refer your manuscript to agents or publishers. But I think that's more common with international editors, not so much in Australia. But there's plenty of international editors that you can hire and work with. So don't think you only need to look in your immediate marketplace for an editor. I didn't hire an editor. I thought my manuscript assessment was enough for me, and I only had a few weeks before my deadline. But I know several authors who have hired private editors with mixed results. Unfortunately, a professional editor can seem quite harsh if you're sensitive about your work, and sometimes that puts authors off and maybe makes them disregard everything the editor has suggested, which of course is the writer's choice. But from my experience of working with editors in newspapers and magazines and within my own publishing house, each editor also has a really different view about the writing. Each editor likes one bit more than another or favours one character over another. So it's always a balancing act for the author to decide how much of an editor's advice they're going to take on. Cost-wise, I think a private editor can be several thousands of dollars. I know one 80,000 word manuscript which the writer considered to be a final draft, so it was already in the best shape she could make it. The cost for editing was about $4,000, but most of the suggestions and the work the editor did were not taken up by the writer, and she submitted the manuscript to a couple of publishers pretty much as it was. So for her, she didn't think it was worthwhile. But also that manuscript is still unpublished, so you know, who knows why that happens. Competitions. So just quickly on the subject of competitions, this is by far the best way to get noticed by an agent and a publisher. Being shortlisted for a writing competition is a big feather in your cap. It means at least 4 or 5 experienced authors, publishers and judges have decided your novel is among the top of the heap. And believe me, there is a heap out there, a heap that never gets read. Publishers often don't even read the first page of a manuscript if the synopsis or cover letter doesn't grab them. And usually that's no fault of the writer or the story, but it could be that there are just too many similar novels around at the time, or that that publisher or that agent doesn't handle books of that genre or that type. In my case, I set myself a deadline to write a manuscript in time to enter the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards for an unpublished manuscript. All up, I had about I had about 9 months from when I decided to write a novel. But because I couldn't write every day, on the days that I could write, I had to set myself a word target of 2,000 words a day. Don't freak out about that, that is high. Most of my writing days, I couldn't start until about 9 or 10 p.m. So I'd go to bed with my laptop sitting on my knees, and often I'd be awake till all hours of the morning, sometimes no sleep at all, and I'd just get out of bed, take my daughter to school, and then take myself off to work. So I met my word count, which was about 70,000 words. I got my manuscript assessment back about 3 weeks before the award deadline. I quickly made the changes I wanted and I entered the award. And luckily I was one of 3 shortlisted. It's a very short shortlist for that award. Often shortlists can be 10 or 5 or 8. It just depends. I've just been judging this year's David Awards for crime writing, and some of the shortlists for each category are 8 and some are 3 and everything in between. Although I didn't win the Unpublished Manuscript Award that year, the winner was Christian White with his manuscript for The Nowhere Child. I tease him now every time I see him. He stole my award. But being shortlisted meant I had publishers and agents contacting me wanting to meet and discuss the manuscript. I decided to go with an agent, Curtis Brown, because I was brand new to this novel writing, and because an agent would then put the manuscript out for auction to all the publishers. And to me, this meant I could then judge between the various offers and get sort of a more accurate idea of what the real value they saw in the novel. From the offers, we chose a 2-book deal with Simon & Schuster, and I've just finished the main draft of the 2nd book, and that's with the publisher now. And I'm waiting for some initial feedback on that, and then I'll go on and do a 3rd draft. So just to reinforce the value of competitions, I think for both agents and publishers, they like them because it reduces the risk of taking a chance on a new writer. They have big financial investment in a new writer. So I'd encourage everyone to look for a competition or award to enter. And I've, on the reference sheet, I've included some good places to keep an eye out for competitions and things that are coming up. So that's that bit. That's all I've got to talk about on that bit. And let's just open up. I think we're pretty almost close to the end of our time. So how about we just open up the questions to those last topics and also to anything else you wanted to talk about. I know originally I was hoping to talk about whether you should get an agent or freewheel, and how you find a publisher, and a little bit about self-publishing. So if you wanted to ask questions about those things, let's do it that way too. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a few questions that have popped up, Karina.
Great.
Once the first draft was done, how many drafts did you complete until you first gave it to the editor?
So I did, my story is a little bit different because I went through a competition. So I did 2 drafts of my manuscript and then entered that into the competition. And then when my manuscript was purchased by the publisher, I did another 2 drafts with the publisher's input. So altogether, 2 drafts on my own and with my assessor. and 2 drafts with the publisher and the publisher's editors. So 4 drafts for me. But often I ask this question a lot of other authors. Often I ask them how many drafts they do before they hand it in to their publishing house. And it ranges from 1, which is like unbelievable, to I was just talking to an author this morning too, and she does about 4 or 5 drafts, sometimes 6 or 7. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so it varies.
Yeah, and then the editors and or the publishing director or your editor will also make suggestions, and there'll be another drafting process with that as well.
You were talking earlier about paying to get your manuscript read. One of our writers totally agrees with you. It's the best feedback that they got.
Oh, that's great to hear. Oh, good.
So is that something that you would encourage writers to do?
Yeah, I would. Because as I say, your friends and your writing buddies can't give you that really objective opinion. And you need and also sometimes it's a bit like the blind leading the blind. You know, if you're a new writer, you don't know everything yet, you know, and your fellow emerging writers, the new writers, don't know everything yet. But the assessments are usually done by really experienced authors, and they've got a good idea of structure and how to market a novel, because ultimately you do have to have an audience, you know, and you do have to find a publisher. So I would definitely recommend an assessor.
Do you have some manuscript assessment services that you could give us the links to?
Yeah, I've put in the reference sheet, I've put in a couple of writing organisations, and I think every one of them will link you into a manuscript assessor. Yeah.
Now, you talked earlier about your word o'clock.
Yes.
What is your word o'clock word count?
For that first novel, Where the Truth Lies, it was 2,000 words, but that was sort of like under sort of difficult circumstances because I couldn't write every day. For the second manuscript that I've just finished, I started out as a word o'clock of 1,500 words a day, and that was every day. That was, 7 days a week. And after about a week, I changed it to 1,000 words a day. And then after about 2 months, I changed it to 500 words a day. So it sort of got smaller and smaller as my energy sort of was used up with sort of thinking, because the more you write, the more you have to recall and think, how is it all going to fit into the big picture? So that sort of slowed my writing down a bit. So but in the end, it went down to 500 words a day.
Now, you were talking before about the synopsis grabbing the attention. Have you got any tips on writing a synopsis?
Yeah, it's a really hard one. Because I had an agent, my agent sort of almost wrote the synopsis with me. So that is there's one of many benefits of having an agent. But the synopsis has got to... There's 2 schools of thought. So you need to tell the whole story about what the novel is about so that the publisher can decide if they're interested or not. So generally don't sort of leave them dangling or try to tease them about the story or try to create mystery or anything. Usually you really do have to lay it out about the beginning, the middle and the end of your story and what themes are in it. So because the synopsis only goes to professional people, either to an agent or a publisher, it's not a sales document as such. It's not trying to entice you to buy the book or create a mystery for someone to want to find out the answer to. It really has to be quite a serviceable synopsis, telling the person about the main characters, the main themes and the main plot through the story. So I would just sort of play it with a straight bat. I wouldn't get too fancy about it.
Mm. We've got a question here. Your book is set in Melbourne, and when you read it, it is lovely to read because you can picture the places that are mentioned in it because they're familiar. How important is writing about the place you know?
I think it's important. Not all authors do. A lot of authors write about places they've never been to or don't know very well. But for me, I wanted to ground it in a city. I wanted to have a place, an identifiable place. And the city almost becomes a character within the story. It's good for people who know the city, but it's also got to be honest and truthful enough so that people who only know one or two things about Melbourne, like they may only know that the MCG is in Melbourne, at least something will register with them that's a truthful description of that place. And so therefore they, even if they don't know the rest of the city, they trust you as an author that if that one thing that they know is truthful, then all the other things about place and about atmosphere and culture that you include in your book is truthful as well.
So do you have a particularly Australian view, do you think, in your writing?
I don't know. I don't think so. I read a lot of Australian writers, but I read writers from all around the world, and I grew up in New Zealand. I don't know. That's a really hard one for me to answer. I'm not sure. Sorry. Maybe someone else could decide.
Now, if anyone has any more questions, please send them through right now. It is 7:30, but Karina has already mentioned to us prior that she's happy to continue and answer any other questions that you might have, whether or not it's related. Here's one for you. When's your next book due?
Well, that's another COVID saga, unfortunately. So it was due out. So the first one came out in March this year, and the second one was due out in about March next year. But because a lot of the publishers have set back their timelines, so there's sort of like a little bit of a backlog building. And so I haven't been informed yet, but I imagine that will mean that all those publication schedules are all going to be set back as well. So all I can say is next year at this time, hopefully in the first half of the year. And that's another Chrissy O'Brien investigation. So Chrissy's still at the Argus in Melbourne. And the Argus, for those who don't know, was a newspaper in Melbourne. And if it was still going, it would be possibly the oldest newspaper in Australia. And in the middle of Melbourne, there's a building that the Argus built and named after itself. And that building is still there. And I really, I love that building. I love architecture and I love Melbourne for that reason. But I love that building and I really wanted to repopulate that building. I really wanted to have those journalists back in that building working in a modern day situation. And so that's why I chose the Argus, and the Argus is actually in that building.
Now, going back to the very beginning, how do you plan the opening chapter?
It depends what type of book you're writing. I don't know if the questioner has got a chance to maybe update that question and say what type of book they're writing, but I would still, regardless of the genre, I would still start with something that really makes a big impression. It really makes somebody care. As I was saying before, you need to care about turning the page, turning the next chapter. And so you can care for all sorts of reasons. You can care because something is sad or something is really exciting or there's a murder or, just because you need to know what happens to the character. so it comes back to that word care. You have to make people care about your character. I think from memory, my book doesn't open in like a big explosion at all, but it's very much, even though it's a crime novel, it's very much a character novel. It's a crime novel, but it's about the character as much as it is about the plot and the crime.
Yes, yeah. Well, it opens on the dock with the girls screaming.
Yeah. So that's quite a lyrical opening, and I often write quite lyrical sentences. Sometimes I go against everything I've said about get rid of those adjectives, or else I just throw them into a couple of little sentences which I just love. So the girls screaming and wheeling. That was a scene I've stood in many times, visiting the docks and standing on the docks. I've felt that scene. It was, it's in my blood, that scene. So to me, that was a really strong starting point for me as a writer. Hopefully it's enough for readers as well to keep wanting to find out.
Now, you did talk about adjectives, but what about adverbs?
Oh, well, yes, they're banned as well. Sorry, not allowed. Nothing to see here, move on.
You mentioned that, that at the moment with Corona, sort of things have been shifted back in time. Do you think that, is that a reflection that perhaps it's getting harder to get published? At the moment,
I think it's getting harder anyway, even without this pandemic. Actually, international book sales during the pandemic have gone up slightly. I think they've globally, and I think that might be steady or just very small amount down in Australia, but overall globally I think book sales are going up. I think people are recognising the value of reading and escaping from this world, and that's what books do. They let us escape into somebody else's world and someone else's story. But I think generally getting published by a traditional publisher is getting harder because it's very hard for them to make a dollar. Their profits are being squeezed, and so they take less risk. They, they really try to narrow down as much of the risk as possible, and that often means that they won't take a chance with a new writer or an unusual writer. I read a book recently. It was almost like a stream of consciousness, I think you describe it as, and I was really surprised that it was published by a mainstream publisher, because it's a risk to take with that sort of book, because it has you either love it or hate it, and if anything, you don't want a lot of people to hate your book, because then the publisher is landed with the cost of having printed it. But self-publishing is an option, and there are a lot of people self-publishing. I'm not a fan of self-publishing, and that's probably because I've seen a lot of people get ripped off by self-publishers. The costs can be really high. I saw an author friend, a proposal she received from a self-publisher recently, where the cost was to her, she would pay $22,000 to have her book published through the self-publisher, and that would include them doing the distribution and marketing. But that's an awful lot of money, and they're really, a lot of self-publishers are just creating a cash flow for themselves. And once they receive their fee, please, all the self-publishers, don't harass me, don't troll me. But a lot of them will receive their money, and they've received their money. So, you know, the outcome or the sales of the book aren't that important to them anymore. They've been paid for their part of the job by the author. But of course, for an author, you want to get your story read. That's more important than anything. And you need people to buy your book and to read it, you know. So I don't know how the sales of self-published books are measured. I haven't actually, there are lots of statistics in the industry that measure book sales, but I'm not sure how self-published book sales are measured. So I don't know. I have heard, I've got a friend who's a romance writer. She makes a lot of money through self-publishing, and she arranges the distribution herself. So there's a lot of success stories. I think if you're going down the road of self-publishing, you need to do a lot of research first and get some, talk to experienced people and get some feedback about the type of deal you can expect and the type of cost, and just who's going to manage the distribution, what networks can they sell the books through, are they, do they have a relationship with a book chain or a big online store or local independent books, all that sort of information. I'd have to narrow it down really good before I went in that direction.
That's some great advice there. One more question for you, Karina. Do you see a future screenplay of the first book?
I'd love that. I do. I could see, like, I'm keen for sort of like a woman who's not a policewoman or police detective to be a sleuth. You know, I think journalists are sleuths. I think we have to have a lot of the skills that detectives have. And I like the added complication that I gave my character and that I felt as a journalist myself, that to ask questions, you have no legal standing or no right to ask anyone a question. You really have to rely on your relationship that you've built up with your contact, or your goodwill, or your professionalism to get people to answer questions. So it's sort of like an added complication for my investigative sleuth, that she has no powers to compel people to answer her questions. So I like that as an extra hurdle for her to try and get over. And I could see that working on a TV series. Let's put that around, shall we?
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much, Karina.
You're welcome.
I'm sure you've given our writers a lot to think about. I'm just going to do a little bit of a plug for your book right now.
Oh, thank you.
This is Karina's book, and we actually have this available at our library, as you can see down here, and we actually have quite a few new editions making their way to our library. So jump online onto our catalogue and reserve your copy. We also have it available as e-resources as well. So I've read it, and I actually really love the main character. She's very quirky. I do. I really like it. If you can't wait, you can also purchase a copy and support Karina.
Of course.
And I'm happy to tell you that the Sun Bookshop is actually delivering. So there's another option for you as well. But I do recommend you pick up a copy of it and read it. Thank you for being part of our very first writers workshop. Hopefully we'll have more.
Actually, I'll just tell you a little story before we go. The book is also available as an audio book, and so I had to audition the voice for Chrissy, and I'd never even thought about having to do this before. So I had about 4 or 5, and so the voices for the audio books are like full-on professional actors. So I had to audition by listening to 4 or 5 women actors and narrow it down to the one that I thought was the most appropriate. But I also then had to write a little description of each character so that she could, the actor, whose name is Megan Smart, she's a young Aussie actor based in Sydney, and so she could get into the sort of slight nuances of the other characters. And one of the sort of descriptions I gave was of Skinny, who's, for those who haven't read Skinny, Skinny is a cat in the book who's quite a main character. And I had to give a description of how Skinny would speak because I wanted her to be able to put on Skinny's swagger when she spoke about him, and sort of move the way that Skinny would move when she was talking about Skinny. So that was a fabulous experience. I didn't even know that sort of thing existed, so that was really great.
Oh, that's wonderful. And just so that you know, Karina, we've got a lot of messages here saying thank you very much for sharing and being so open about your process and your journey, and giving so many practical tips along the way. So once again, thank you all very much. We hope that this will help you in your own journey, with your own writing journey. We do have writers groups at our libraries, so you can jump online and look at our website and get in contact with us about those. And we wish you all the very best. And keep safe, everyone.
Good luck, everyone, and keep writing. And thanks very much for jumping online.
You
See you all.
See you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.